Hello everyone, welcome back to the show. My name's Dan, this is Exploder, and I'm here with another episode just for you and whoever's listening. And if there's people around you, thank you for bringing people to the show. It's an audio show, I can't see you, I assume you're there, but we'll just pretend like there is. In this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about history. I have a history degree. I mention it now and again because, quite frankly, it's the only benefit of having a history degree is occasionally you get to say things like, I have a history degree. Anyway, part of having a history degree is that you learn to do a lot of research, and I had a professor that said, they may have borrowed it, I don't know, but I had a professor in college that said, an expert is somebody who knows more and more about less and less. Now, if you don't know what that means, it means when you learn something enough, you know a lot of details about sometimes the smallest little issue. I had a professor that her specialty was the 100 Years' War. Her specialization was a single war. Now, the war went a long time, as the term 100 Years' Wars would imply, but the idea that one person can spend so much research on one particular part of history, that's very interesting. So I like history, but I like to learn more and more and more. And in this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about wrestling. I've talked about everything from clowns to Dusty Rhodes to Gold Dust, and there's a lot of Rhodes references there. Anyway, I've talked about a lot of stuff, and in this one, I want to talk a little bit more history. Now, this topic is very broad. It's a very long. It's like last week's episode. It's very much like last week's episode when you were talking about I was talking about. What were you talking about? I don't know. Where I was talking about, the divide between sport and entertainment, and sort of how that's been around since the beginning of professional wrestling as we understand it. And it's a very broad topic, and it's a topic that, quite frankly, I could go back to at some time and sort of dive deeper into it, because there's a lot there. This is another issue. This is the same thing. In this case, I want to talk about briefly, brief as far as I can, but briefly, I want to talk about the role of the National Wrestling Alliance. Now, the National Wrestling Alliance, of course, has existed since the 40s in some form or another. I believe the meeting was 1948, held in a hotel in St. Louis, which I'm pretty sure that hotel's still standing, which I think is pretty cool. And it was guys like Orville Brown and Sam Munchnick and a lot of promoters at the time. And what was happening was, there was, as I mentioned in the last episode, there was an attempt in the early 2000s to sort of crown an undisputed world champion. And it did fine for a while when, there were, 20 people in the world that wrestled, or, that's exaggerating, but you know what I mean. The thing was, as promoters tend to do, they start going in and doing what they want and stealing each other's people and going into towns that the other guy's running and yada, yada, yada. And it became more of a Wild West. Everyone had a world champion. Everyone from Virginia to St. Louis to New York to Chicago to Podunk, Alabama. Everyone had a world champion. So the idea of a world champion at that time didn't mean anything. So this went on for decades, and finally in 1948, these promoters got together in this hotel, and they decided they were going to deal with this. And the institution they created to deal with these problems, these internal problems, was a group called the National Wrestling Alliance. Now, in 1904, when we're talking about George Hackenschmidt and Tom Jenkins, that was under something called the National Wrestling Association, which is a completely different concept. This was basically the idea that everyone would have their own promotion, people that already had promotions, the Orville Browns, the Sam Munchnicks, and a lot of other promoters that, quite frankly, I don't know off the top of my head, but they would get together, and this would be an alliance of those companies. All these promotions would exist, and they would come under a general set of rules. They would determine a champion who would travel among them, which was, if you think about it, very revolutionary for the time. This is a time where, cars were not, traveling from, St. Louis to Chicago or St. Louis to New York is not a small feat. So the idea of a traveling champion, still very carny, but that's still pretty different. Now you can fly everywhere, but back then, probably not as common. But there was going to be these governing rules, and they would have a board, and the board, of course, would be the promoters of these different groups. And part of the rules they established was the fact that they would have a governing set of rules, they would have a traveling champion, but they'd also have what we all know now as territories. Basically, anyone who promoted in a certain area was guaranteed that area, and other board members agreed they would never go into that territory. So if you were, let's say you were running Wrestling at the Chase, classic show on the Dumont Network years ago. The Dumont Network, by the way, is the precursor to ABC. ABC did not exist when the Dumont Network did. So that's how old this was. This was years and years ago. But if you were running Wrestling at the Chase, then Vince McMahon Sr. would not come into your area. And if you were Vince McMahon, Don Owen from Portland wouldn't come into your area. Not saying he would, but there were rules saying that they wouldn't. They agreed not to do it. And the end result, and I want to make this very clear because this is something that's actually been looked into. The United States government looked into this, and this is true. And this is something I want to say. I like the end result. The end result was a territory system where, you could have guys in Houston and Amarillo, and you had guys in Minneapolis and Kansas City and Oklahoma and Ohio was cut into, I think, like 3 different areas. 3 different promoters had Ohio, and I'm from Ohio, so there you go. But you had the Sheik, Ed Farhat in Detroit, and he went through Ohio. You had Georgia Championship Wrestling, you had Mid-Atlantic, you had Continental, you had all these different promotions, and it created a lot of guys, and it created a spot for a lot of guys, and he had regional wrestling, and you'd have wrestling where, you'd have wrestling, quite frankly, 3, 4, 5 times a week, in the territory. Some territories, there were bigger stretches because of the population, and sometimes it was shorter stretches. You'd do this town on Monday, this town on Tuesday, TV on Wednesday, and you do a big show on Saturday or something like that. And that was a system that was created during this territory system. And you could, because if you're the only game in Kansas City, you can do whatever you want. I mean, and don't get me wrong, some people still ruined their situation there. They still went bankrupt. They still made some horrible decisions and had to sell to another promoter and sort of get the heck out of town and hope that guy can save it. But at the same time, it was still a pretty cushy system, if you really think about it. Now, why I preface this by saying I like the results. I like the territories. I like, going back and watching Mid-South, which was a very particular TV show compared to the AWA, which is a very particular TV show for a different market. What I say is, while I like the result, the reality is what you have to face is the NWA, as we understood it and as it was a trust. Now, if you don't know, I assume many of my listeners are adults and at least have a vague understanding of business in this sense. A trust is exactly what it sounds like. A trust is when multiple companies get together and make unofficial agreements on how they're going to conduct their independent businesses. I literally just described the NWA. If you really think about it, that's what the NWA was. The NWA was a bunch of promoters. Tootsmont didn't work for Sam Munchnick. Sam Munchnick didn't work for Don Owen. Don Owen didn't work for Roy Shire. Roy Shire didn't work for Gene LaBelle. Gene LaBelle didn't work for Fritz von Erich, and so on and so forth. I could go on and on and on. These were separate people. And if you were Paul Bosch, you didn't work for Eddie Graham, but you made an agreement separately through the NWA, through the National Wrestling Alliance, that, I'm not going to come to Florida. Paul Bosch said, I'm not going to come to Florida. Eddie Graham said, I'm not going to go to Memphis. Jerry Jarrett said, I'm certainly not going to. And I know these are years later. These are not the 1948 NWA, but you know what I'm saying. They agreed amongst themselves that they wouldn't go into these territories, and they agreed on things like pay rates for the NWA champion. This is the trust. This is the actions of a trust. This is the same thing that William Howard Taft, and I'm not joking here, fattest president, who people remember for getting stuck in a bathtub in the White House. What he also did was he busted trusts like a lot. He used the executive power to put, I believe it was 70 different cases to bust up trusts that were going on, mostly in the railroads. Railroad companies were, if you're in North Dakota and you're the railroad, another company would go, they agree ahead of time, I'm not going to come into that area. So you'll be the only railroad in that area if you agree not to come to mine. Because if one comes to the other, they're going to drive prices down. But if you're the only one in North Dakota, or the only one in this part of North Dakota, you can charge whatever you want. And William Howard Taft was big on this. He was busting trusts like a monster. I mean that in a good way. But that's what this was. So at the time, the NWA at one point was being looked at by the FBI as a trust. And for all intents and purposes, again, whether you agree with you can agree with the outcome. I like what the outcome was. It was a trust. This is like saying, if McDonald's and Burger King got together and worked a way to fix prices and all burgers from here on out would cost $1.50, all of them, everything, Big Mac, Whopper, all of them. Well, you like the end result. You're like, okay, the burgers are cheaper now, but it's still price fixing. It's the same, it's two separate things, but it's still price fixing. That's still what was going on here. This was a trust. So while this was a good thing, and it created a system that existed for about 40 years, understand about this trust of the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, we all look upon fondly, existed for 40 years. But along the way, there's a downside. What's the downside? Well, the downside is, as you build a trust, as a company has a territory that's protected, and they don't have to worry about someone coming in and driving prices down and taking talent away. And if you wanted to, get rid of, if you were done with the talent, you could send them to, if you were done with the talent in St. Louis, you could send them to Florida. And it was sort of a talent exchange. Well, you can go to Florida and you'll be over here, and you don't have to worry about someone coming in and offering your top star a better deal. I mean, not to say guys didn't travel, but it wasn't anything really threatening. It's like right now, if you're a team owner in the NBA, there's really no big threat of an outside organization coming in and offering LeBron James a better deal. Because really, where's he going to go? Europe? I guarantee they don't make that kind of money in Europe. For the sports fans, that's really what it is. It's like the only game in town. You don't have to worry about someone coming in and offering your biggest star a better show, because quite frankly, you are the show. Now, there were problems in the NWA. I mean, going back to, like I mentioned in the last episode, going back to 1960, where Verne Gagne left the NWA. Now, he left the NWA to basically have his own world champion. But very particular about this, when he left the NWA, he decided he liked the territory system, so he kept it. So he said, I'm going to create the NWA, I'm going to have my own world champion, but you know what? I'm going to keep the territory. I'm not going to go in and start messing things up that wise. 1963, when the Worldwide Wrestling Federation of Toots Mondt and Vince McMahon Sr., when they left, guess what they did? They kept the territories. He didn't, the WWF didn't immediately leave the NWA and then start promoting in St. Louis. It didn't work like that. They kept the territory. So there really was no threat of that. That system was in place. Even when people left to create their own world titles and their own companies and this whole concept, they still were like, okay, but here are the borders, and I know my borders, and I won't go against that. So it was still keeping that old boys network together. Now, of course, before this, there were fights amongst each other, these small outlaw outfits, the outlaw promotions, guys who were banned and this and that and blackballed, and would sort of have these little shows, but they were never anything substantial. The AWA never had to deal with a substantial outlaw show. I mean, the biggest outlaw show, if you want to call it that, which it kind of was ICW with the Poffos, which is where Randy Savage got his start, and Leaping Lanny and all these things were by Angelo Poffo, which was by all means not an official NWA thing. So it wasn't an NWA promotion, so it was an outlaw promotion. And then of course there was a fight between business partners and Ann Gunkel, who was the widow of Ray Gunkel, who had passed away, and Ann Gunkel decided she was just going to take over the territory. Well, his business partners didn't care for that, and for a while there was a little fight there, but that eventually was settled, I guess, as I understand it. Ann Gunkel got sort of froze out, and the NWA, that promotion kept going, and the NWA was happy once again. The reason you know it's a trust, and I'm making this very clear, the reason you know it's a trust is because the minute there was any actual pressure put on the territory system, the whole thing fell apart. That pressure against the territory system, against the NWA, against a trust, was brought by Vincent Kennedy McMahon in 1984, the devil of the NWA. But honestly, this is what he did. He was the first one to come in and to say, he was going to people, and you can argue about his business acumen, you can argue about what he did, how he was going to people and offering, they were getting TV for free, and he was going to pay them to put his show on the air. So he was displacing, the AWA. He was displacing these guys by saying, hey, you're getting, this programming. How about you get my programming and I'll pay you? I'll pay the network. I'll pay the local affiliate to syndication. I'll pay you to put my show on the air, like an infomercial. Well, that's that's really enticing when you're just having a show, or you can have a show and you can get paid. And you can talk about, how he put Survivor Series on the air and said, if you carry this, if you don't carry this, you can't have WrestleMania, things like that. You can argue about this, but this is the guy who came up to the old promoters, the good old boy network as it was, who had territories and were fine, and they owned this particular area and they were fine with it, and no one ever came and threatened them. He came in, he took their TV through, legal ways, but he took their TV, and then he did the one thing they never had to deal with for 40 years. He went to their top guys. He went to Hulk Hogan. He went to Jerry Lawler. He went to Greg Valentine. He went to all of these guys and said, I'll pay you more. I'll pay you more money. I'll make you a national name. I'll put you on a Wheaties box, a video game, an action figure. He did the one thing as a capitalist, and again, you can, whether you like it or not, whether you like the result or not, as a capitalist, he went in and did what you would normally do in a normal circumstance. If you work for Walmart, You don't make agreements with Kmart on where you're going to put a place. You're just going to do what's best for your company, and you hope the other person, hope that they can compete. What Vince McMahon did was exactly that. He put a restaurant, if you're a McDonald's, he put a Burger King next door, and he just made a better sandwich. And yes, maybe he got one of your employees, but at the same time, it's arguable. I don't think it's that arguable, but it's arguable that it's your job to also keep your employees. It's your job to make a better burger. And that's how competition works. The NWA had gone so long that they didn't have that competition. They didn't need that competition. That was a system that they'd created, but it created complacency. It created a complacency where the end result was great. The territories were great. I mean, everyone could talk about their favorite territory and all the talent that came through, and even people that worked for the WWF and WCW later on came from these territories. And it's great. Like I said, the end result's great, but it created this complacency. The trust that was the NWA fell apart because of the first person who had a legitimate chance of challenging it. And then, now, of course, 1960, the AWA, 1963, the WWF. I almost said too many W's there. That'd been weird. Then the NWA and the AWA got together. They decided they were going to co-promote because they were going to compete on a national brand. And they started Pro Wrestling USA. And then, what you would expect to happen when people start competing, internal disputes, creative control, power, revenue sharing. Pro Wrestling USA fell apart. Nothing. Then as the national system grew, they went into complete panic mode. Just lost their minds. And they got together and they decided to do this thing called Super Clash. Now they did Super Clash, blah, 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 and then Super Clash 3. It got to the point where Super Clash 3, where they couldn't trust each other because the guys who were working together to be a national powerhouse to compete against the WWF that had better production value, that were traveling, they couldn't agree with each other long enough that they weren't trying to steal each other's talent. So these guys who spent 40 years sort of staying in their lane and doing what they did now have a national, a person going nationally, have a person who's fighting, creating this whole new system on a national scale. And they decide we're going to get together, which is a smart move in theory. And they get together and then they can't trust each other long enough to, hey, we're not making enough money. Well, so-and-so's getting all the money from the show. Well, so-and-so's trying to recruit my top guy, and so on and so forth. So the thing fell apart. And then others, on top of this, just to make it worse, on top of this, people start pulling out of the NWA, like the UWF, the Bill Watts one, not the Herb Abrams cocaine one. And they pull out, so they become their own thing. It didn't succeed, and of course they go bankrupt because the economy of Oklahoma takes a downturn, and the UWF is eventually sold to Jim Crockett Promotions, and they're in such a financial situation that Jim Crockett Promotions itself is in so much trouble they have to sell to Turner. So UWF fails. It sells to Jim Crockett Promotions. Jim Crockett Promotions basically fails. They have to sell to Turner. But it's even bad this way. World Class left the NWA in 1986 to try and be its own national promotion. It failed. So because now they're, after these years of complacency, now they're trying to face a national powerhouse, and they're trying to do it with depleted rosters, and they're trying to do it in a way that they don't know how to do. With all due respect to guys like Fritz von Erich, he didn't know how to do things on a national scale. And I'm not the only one saying this. I'm not some hot take that I've got some podcast in Lima, Ohio where I'm throwing out the hot takes and I understand. But this is just common knowledge. I mean, really, that's what this is. It is a common knowledge thing. No one, with maybe the exception of Vern Gagne, and even then his roster was depleted and his ideas were a little out of date. And I don't mean that to disparage him. I think he was a talented promoter and a wrestler and a legend by all means. But look at the sauce, man. Look at what happened. Every time someone from this old system tried to compete on a national system, tried to compete their own way, and it never worked. They tried to work together, they couldn't. They tried to do it on their own, they couldn't. World Class was eventually teamed with former NWA member Continental Wrestling Association, the CWA. They got together and created, they tried to work with an interpromotional, didn't work. Then World Class and the CWA merged into the United States Wrestling Association, which I explained in another episode, which is, for all intents and purposes, the last territory in professional wrestling. It does not have the long legacy. I mean, the whole thing started, I believe, in 1991. So the company itself, the actual promotion, is not a huge one, but is the last territory of any lineage in professional wrestling, and it folded in 1997 under some very controversial circumstances. Internationally, Empresa Mexicana de Lucha Libre, All Japan, and New Japan all seceded from the NWA in the mid 80s. Now that's not that doesn't mean much domestically, but you have to understand this is a point where people are bailing on the NWA, because at the same time, while in America everyone's getting hit by the WWF tidal wave, if you want to call it that way, internationally there was no benefit anymore. There was no benefit of being an NWA member, and that's why you saw EMLL, All Japan, and New Japan both leave the NWA. WCW, like I mentioned, Jim Crockett Promotions was sold to Turner Sports. It was renamed to World Championship Wrestling, the name of the former show, and which the WCW was eventually killed by corporate America, and I'll explain that in a future episode, I promise. But they still recognize the NWA champion, because Jim Crockett Promotions for a while basically was the NWA. The NWA was falling apart and everyone was leaving and no one was making any money. And the only one that was actually making any money was Jim Crockett Promotions. So they had the NWA champion, they had Ric Flair, they had Sting, they had Barry Windham, they had all these guys. So they were the NWA. And the NWA title was their world title. So it was sort of this weird way. When Turner bought Jim Crockett Promotions, they indirectly bought the NWA. Now, the NWA title was they started recognizing the WCW championship as their own, and the NWA officially stopped being associated with WCW in 1993. Now it gets worse. A small little ragtag organization originally started as a super show concept called Eastern Championship Wrestling left in 1994. After an NWA title tournament, let's saw Shane Douglas win the vacant NWA title, then immediately curse out tell all the NWA champions to kiss his ass, drop the belt, and decide he wasn't the champion anymore. The next day, after they convinced Dennis Coralluzzo that they were going to do an angle out of it, the next day they folded. Todd Gordon folded Eastern Championship Wrestling and opened Extreme Championship Wrestling. Maybe you've heard of it. Now, all of that said, and of course the NWA at the time, the NWA was sort of dead at that point. They were small, incredibly small. I don't even know if you call it an alliance anymore, because at that point it became like, remember the National Lampoon movies? I'm going to get a little off here, but remember the National Lampoon movies? And the National Lampoon movies were, these really well done movies, Animal House and things like that, A Christmas Vacation, European Vacation, so on and so forth. And then by the 90s, it became a license. Every horrible, crappy, little rinky-dink, little BS movie you ever seen in your life, they put National Lampoon above it. National Lampoon's Pucked. Pucked. It's got John Bon Jovi in it, and I don't know why. Or this or that. I mean, just Gold Diggers is a good one, which is awful. It's got Will Friedle from Boy Meets World, the older brother. Don't ask me how I know that. But why? Why the quality had gone down? Well, you know why the quality had gone down? Because it was a license. They could make any movie they wanted, as long as they paid Tim Matheson, who owned the rights at the time, as long as they paid Tim Matheson a fee, they could put the words National Lampoon on the front of the DVD. Well, really VHS, but it's on the front of the box. It had nothing to do with quality, it's just what it was. And that's what the NWA became in the 90s. After the WCW left, after ECW was a small company, but how they left was probably a bigger deal than that they left. But at that point, there were so many small little promotions, and all they had to do was pay a yearly fee to be part of the NWA, and they could be NWA, NWA Smoky Mountain, NWA Florida, NWA so-and-so, NWA Wildside, NWA 2000, NWA, I could go on. And because it was basically a license. You were associated with the NWA, but the problem with the NWA became more of a headache than it was an asset. Because there was no one there. There was no Jim Crockett Promotions. There was no national powerhouse or anything approaching it. WCW was the last vestige of any semblance of power for the NWA. And when they lost that, they lost everything. And that's where it left until, oddly enough, NWA TNA was born, and they brought back the NWA title and the NWA tag team titles, and it was the national exposure to the NWA again. Now, of course, the NWA, from what I understand, some of their machinations, how they decided they were still going to get percentage of bookings and so on and so forth, and the business just wasn't working out, and it got to the point where even TNA just stopped being associated with the NWA, and that was it. And now, they're owned by Billy Corgan, I assume because the lead singer of Smash Mouth was too busy doing something else. And, let's see. Will they become a big name in wrestling again? I doubt it. I mean, I don't know. I doubt it. You can never, in wrestling, you can never say never. I mean, that's a thing you can always say. I mean, but I don't know. To me, it's such a brand that's been so beat up and roughed up and destroyed, and just, I don't know if it's ever going to be near what it was. It's never going to be what it was in 48. It's never going to be what it was even in 60 or 65. It's never going to be that big thing. It's never going to be what it was in the 70s or the 80s, with the classics that we all remember, the Ric Flairs, the Ricky Steamboats, the different territories. But will it, as the NWA, be even a single promotion with that kind of prominence again? I doubt it, and I don't want that to be a negative, but I mean, I hope, maybe, but we'll have to see, I guess. Now, on top of all this, as I've said, they were a trust. People were pulling out. It didn't, it ended. Then all these things. What were some of the positives? What were some of the positives of this system, the NWA system, failing? People don't talk about this. People don't talk about the positives. Everyone talks about, they longingly remember the NWA. They remember these things, and rightfully so. But what were some of the positives that have fallen apart? Well, there's a couple things. One was the rise of cable television. The rise of cable television put somebody in Kansas City able to watch TV from anywhere. So instead of watching local syndication, the local ABC affiliate, the local NBC affiliate, maybe if you had really hardcore farmer vision, maybe PBS. But cable television made it to where national TV was truly a thing, and not just for 2 or 3 networks. With cable television rose, which was completely separate from wrestling, but wrestling certainly took advantage of it, absolutely. This was the rise of national TV. The rise of national TV helps a national company. Now, of course, this also is the rise of closed circuit television, and that was the precursor to pay-per-view. Now, under the old system, a pay-per-view in Kansas City, when all you would get would be local Houston television, wouldn't work. If you're watching Paul Bosch and another promotion comes along and says, hey, we're going to offer you a pay-per-view for $10, and you get to see The Sheik and Dick the Bruiser and Bobo Brazil, and you go, who the heck are any of those people? It doesn't make any sense. So a national pay-per-view wouldn't make any sense if you're only getting a local TV. Now, with the rise of cable television, there's an opportunity for national exposure. The problem was the NWA system wouldn't allow for that. The NWA system as it was territories. You weren't going to go into Kansas City and put your TV on there and get on their cable stations, because if you did, you're violating the territories, which the system had worked out for so long that, well, why rock the boat? Even when the AWA left in 1960, even when the WWF left in 1963, why rock that boat? So they didn't. So a national TV, a national pay-per-view, and it led to a national promotion. It was a natural fit for a national promotion to come in and have a national TV presence through cable, and to turn into eventually a national pay-per-view, the WrestleManias, the Starrcades. Regional TV or local TV was good for live events and local TV. That was it. National TV and national pay-per-view would not work on a local system. Another positive on this was business. Quite frankly, it boomed in a different way. I mean, there's stories, of course, everyone was talking about, in territories of, like I said, traveling 3, 4, 5 days a week, working in different towns. You'd do this town on Monday, this town on Tuesday, and so on and so forth. And for the people that were in those territories, some guys were making money, and then other guys were working for Jerry Jarrett. But everyone else was making good money. They were doing well. And if you could get in the business, you could do pretty well, and you didn't get yourself blackballed for doing something stupid, and you had to do something really stupid, then you could still make a pretty good living at it and be doing it constantly. You could be working 5-6 days a week. Now that changed. Wrestling is no longer, it is, but it's not. It's no longer every promotion. There are indie guys out there that work on weekends, or there are guys right now who make good money working. And they make their money, but they got to make their money in certain places. If you're an indie guy, you're working all over the place to make a little bit of money. If you make, if you're in Japan or in Mexico, you might make a little more, but you got to manage your expectations. You're not going to be traveling around Indiana making the kind of full-time money that you would have made in 1986. It's just not going to happen. So the regional promotions and the local promotions are not as good as they were, and there's not wrestling on Monday nights and Tuesday nights, and there's not shows at the Sportatorium, certainly not shows at the Sportatorium, but there's not shows every week, and there's not wrestling, this thing that we all remember. However, wrestling went from a regional promotion to 1 or 2 national promotions, and those promotions do really well. It condensed the business. It condensed everything from 15, 20 territories into 1 or 2 major companies, but those 1 or 2 major companies do really well. So if you're at the height of your skill and you do really well at what you do, you can make decent money. You can be a guy that really comes to mind right now is a guy like Ricochet. or even AJ Styles, people that start out in local promotions and sort of cut their teeth and make, sometimes they make a hot dog and a handshake, those types of deal. And then they move on to promotions where they make a little more money, and then they get a look at, and then they get hired by a company that puts them on a contract, and all of these work into working for WWE one day. Now, hopefully, now we're talking about guys moving in who are, all elite wrestling. Some guys want to go to Japan. Some guys want to go to Mexico. Some, things like that. So now it's something where there's something to work toward, and instead of hoping to get into, AWA, now you're hoping to get into WWE. It used to be where you'd be able to work around, you'd work for Don Owens, or you'd work for Bill Watts, or you'd work for so on and so forth. Now the goal is to work for one or two or maybe three people, one of these people. So it condenses the top, it condenses the ceiling, so to speak. But at the same time, you can also say, if you look at what WWE does and what All Elite Wrestling does and New Japan does, if you look at this, you can clearly see this is not a trust. This is not guys working together. These are companies that, quite frankly, adhere to the law. Now, Japan is a little different. All Japan and New Japan have worked together, not as trust, but in a co-promotional. And in America, I'm pretty sure Vince McMahon would have you taken out back and shot if you even floated that idea. But yeah, so it changed that well. So it condensed it, but condensing everything into those one or two promotions does well because, right, frankly, as good as they are, I don't think Roman Reigns or John Cena would make what they make now. I don't think they'd make that in a territory system. I don't think that economically would make any sense, because John Cena merchandise selling in Memphis, I'm sure would make okay money, but I don't think they'd sell national numbers in one or two towns. So it's one of those things where it's condensed it, but it also made it more profitable. It made it more mainstream. It made it more national. So that's the end result of the NWA system, the territory system, the regional system falling apart and being broken apart by straight up capitalism, by straight up Vince McMahon going in and going on a national scale. The end result was actually good. Yeah, there's not as many promotions, major promotions, but the end result for the wrestler, better in some ways. Some ways it sucks because there's only one or two places to really work and make money. And that's the debate. Like I said, this is a topic we could get into, and I could get much further into this, and that's something I might revisit in the future. But I just wanted to get that off. I don't know, I've been thinking, again, I when I come to record these, I always have something in my head, rattling around in my head for a few days. And then I decided I just got to let it out. I just got to get it out and see what people think. Do you have any ideas? Like my thing is, what do you think about this? What do you think about the fall of the NWA? I know I'm my trainers and people that I know personally in the wrestling business are a lot of them are old school minded, and they love the territories, and I do too, in a way. I love some of the stuff they produced. I love watching some of the old footage. Absolutely. I like seeing the different production styles and things like that. But I want to hear your opinion on this. Anyone who's listening to this show, what do you think? What do you think about the fall of the NWA? Do you think that it ultimately helped the business or it hurt it? What do you think about the role of the NWA as a trust, and how it was sort of by design was anti-competitive and was anti-capitalist, even when the results were actually pretty good? So just what are your thoughts? Put a comment below the video. If you're watching the video version, put a comment below. If you're listening online, I don't know. I want to continue the conversation. So if you're in the Lima, Ohio area, I know that's probably not many of you, but if you are, I'm a stand-up comedian. I will not be on this show, but I will be attending because I'm very supportive of everyone involved. Comedy Outlaws will be Lima Land Comedy and Comedy Outlaws will be presenting a all-female show at Legends July 19th, 9:30 p.m. at Legends Tavern. It'll be Charlie Hester, Jody McDermott. Great female comedians. It's going to be a very great show. So if you're local and by chance, come check it out. It's going to be a great show. August 3rd, Beans on Parade at Art Space Lima. I will be on that show. I know right now we have one show, but it just sold it. I think we're about to open tickets for the second show. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure. And if you have a chance, again, if you're local and you have a chance, come check that out. Very funny. Josh Adams is headlining, and it's going to be a great show. So until next time, I'll come back with a new topic, and I'll bat it out and, see what we can do. Until next time, my name's Dan. This is Exploder. Have a good one.